Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Welcome to episode 4 in this 6-part special by the review of religions regarding race inequality and race relations in light of the recent events in the United States of America. We spoke in the last show about how citizens should respond. We spoke about voting and so on. But what about the leaders? What about the rulers? What about the people who govern? Islam, being a perfectly balanced religion giving guidance on all matters, has also given guidance on this. And today we want to look at some of these solutions and what the world says and what Islam has to say is the solutions to these things. So I'm going to get straight into it. Mulana Azhar, it reminds me of something that His Holiness, the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, was once explaining to me about the teachings of Islam and looking at the responsibility of leaders, because we previously spoke about the responsibility and duties of the citizens. But in terms of leaders, His Holiness was once explaining to me something that's very interesting, that Pharaoh, who the Abrahamic religions all believe the story of Moses, peace be upon him, and the Pharaoh who was extremely cruel to his people and rejected the message of Moses, which was in fact the message of God. His Holiness was explaining to me that God's punishment on Pharaoh was not only for the reason that he rejected the message of Moses, peace be upon him. This was not the only reason that he was punished, that he rejected the message of God, the message of Moses. He was also punished for his cruelty to the people, his injustices and mistreatment of the people. I find that a very powerful lesson for us, that as we know, many times the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, as well as the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, explained that Islam is based on two overarching principles. One is service to God and the other is service to God's creation. They are both equal in the sense that a person can spend all day worshipping God in the mosque, but if he or she is not good to God's people, to humanity, to his or her neighbors, to helping the poor, helping the needy, showing love and affection to people, then his worship will be in vain. So we've discussed a lot about the duties of a citizen, how a citizen should behave, and the requirements that are put on a citizen. But if we look at the teachings of Islam and the duties that are entrusted to leaders, I think no one would actually want to be a leader. It's so frightening to look at the lofty expectations placed upon leaders by Islam and by God, and the punishment placed for a leader who does not dispense with that justice. Mulana Azhar, how do you see this?
Well, I see it playing out in the history of nations, and I see it in my own nation, that you want to establish a peaceful order. There will be no one in society who will object to the rule of law. And for the most part, you have a productive, prosperous society where everyone is able to move forward and achieve their needs, etc. But this is not what we see. And you ask the question, well, why is it? And it comes down to this very point you're raising, that whenever the people who are in power, who have the capacity to make laws or enact the laws that, or to enforce the laws that are made, and they fail to do that. In fact, they try to abuse the system for their own personal advantages or for their own prejudicial position of a certain group. That ripple effect in society cannot be stopped. And it winds up leading to social unrest. What Huzur mentioned recently about the situation in America is the same thing, that if we're not careful in the government, if we're not careful to fulfill the rights of the people, it would wind up once again into civil unrest and perhaps civil war. Now, when we heard that, the person who was interviewing Huzur, this was in Canada, he was kind of struck by this, that if you implement certain policies in America to prevent immigration of certain groups, how would it lead to war? How would it cause civil unrest? But since that time, that's all we've seen, is an increasing level of discontent in our nation because of a denial of fundamental rights and the discontinued use of justice and applied to all people. I would also say that now, unfortunately, it's not just America. What Azul is talking about is this rise of a certain element in many societies, in Europe and in Australia and other countries around the world. These elements that you can say are, again, prejudiced or biased, or if you don't want to use the word racist, but they definitely have this inclination to only look after a certain group and try to force the others out or keep the others down. That rise of this far right group around the world is leading to what we're seeing today. Part of why the world is protesting, because it's not just in America these pressures are there. We're seeing it in other parts of the world, and those groups who are facing the similar kind of societal structures are raising a voice that, yes, this is wrong. Whether it's in America or anywhere else in the world, this is wrong. So it is a warning to the leaders of the world, that Huzur gave a warning to the leaders of the Arab Spring nations, and he's giving the warning to the European and Western nations. And it's going to be true for any nation, that you must fulfill the rights of the people, or they will eventually. It'll be like a powder keg trying to keep it under control. It will finally explode. There'll be a volcanic reaction. And then it's everywhere, it's the disorder and disruption and death raining upon your society. We don't want that.
And of course, when the Arab Spring happened at the time, His Holiness, when he gave the sermon, some people in the world were a bit surprised, because it seemed like from both sides, the leaders were being even more brutal towards the citizens, and citizens were reacting in this way. But people felt that, His Holiness was giving this message. But after a few years, it came to light that actually this was the best teachings in the interests of both the people and the leaders, which wasn't His Holiness's new teaching. He was simply quoting from the Quran and the Sunnah, the Holy Prophet's message.
Recently, Huzur mentioned something that was very striking about leadership. And he said that surprisingly, during this COVID crisis around the world, those nations which are ruled by women have done much better. And in particular, he talked about New Zealand and Germany and some other places, South Korea. He said because the women's own inclination is one, empathy toward the suffering of people, because that's how they're raised as mothers, to recognize and empathize and to respond to the suffering of people. And thus they have done much better. And it's not only in that case. You see, again, look what happened recently in New Zealand with the shooting in that mosque by the extremist groups, and the response of the leader of that nation was so remarkable. Everyone talked about how she responded as opposed to other nations in the world, because she gave the message right away that you are part of us and we are part of you. Your suffering is our suffering, and we stand with you against such a thing ever happening again. That stamped out all of that oppression of one group, one race, one ethnic group by others. And it hasn't risen again in that nation. So this is a quality that we have examples that when leaders fulfill their rights and their roles of the trust of a society, society responds in a positive way, and it creates peace in that society, as opposed to the heavy-handed, the desire of a leader to of personal vested interests, et cetera, which lead to further chaos, confusion, and warfare, civil or otherwise.
Dr. Basir, I was thinking of something that the Second Worldwide Head of the Arabic Community says in the economic system of Islam. And it's something that sometimes is not recognized at the moment. And he actually, when he's referring to the whole economic model that Islam espouses, and he refers to America, he actually mentions in one place that America owes a debt to the slaves who helped actually build the economy of America. He mentions this in his book, The Economic System of Islam. Can you expand on this? Because people, of course, it may seem obvious to people that there was slavery, there was torture, but they sometimes forget this part about why they were actually being used. And actually, they had a significant role in America using them wrongly to build up their whole economy. Can you shed some light on this? And the fact that also, as he mentions, they owe a debt, leaving aside the whole debate about how we can repay that, to even acknowledge this fact is something that needs to be done first.
Very remarkable. Yes, absolutely. And that's something I think the African world is still waiting for. And the former enslaved in the African world are waiting for. But I think that's a very key point, to recognize, even as I was listening to earlier part of this conversation, the question of, Black industriousness and and Black capacity and creativity and ability. For 200 years, African peoples enslaved in the Americas were responsible for the rise of Western economy and social life. Without slavery in the Americas, none of the European countries would exist in the fashion or form they exist today, right? And I say that not just because it sounds like an interesting thing to say. Walter Rodney, we're not related, but Walter Rodney, a Caribbean scholar, did his PhD thesis on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And in it, he cataloged at great length how the depeopling of Africa to create the system of Western transatlantic slavery elevated European communities and empires, right? I mean, the British Empire was built on this system. And, so America, of course, coming out of British Empire was also built. And we have all the models. And recently, if you've been paying attention in different parts of the United States, we've been covering, here in St. Louis, St. Louis University, one of our flagship Catholic universities, they have in the archives, the 40 Africans that were taken from the East and to St. Louis area here to build the university. They actually have that list of people. And all over the country, we have evidence that this is what happened with Black people taken in slavery and taken to place to build plantation homes, to build the nation's capital. Right? To build the capital of the United States. So that is an enduring debt. If you look at, France and the history of Haiti and how Haitian Black labor, enslaved people were used to build up the French Empire. It was such a big thing that Napoleon went and fought for it, right? When the Haitians pushed back Europeans and claimed the first Black nation on earth as independent, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law down there to try to get the country back. It was that important to them. Similarly, the British spent all of the last 50 years of the 1600s trying to wrestle pieces of the so-called Spanish Empire that contained Black people and the wealth of the Western Hemisphere. So that's a debt that has been owed, that has been cataloged in history and recorded. There's the logs of people taken and the wealth that was built. All of that is written down. That's records that they've kept, and Europeans know what that is and what that means to not have the history the way it was written, the way we understand it, capitalism as we know it, without acknowledging that debt. Right? That still remains. So it's very powerful that the second Khalifa, who had a way of seeing these things, could communicate that Europe owes a debt, and America owes a debt to the enslaved who built these nations, built these systems, built these buildings, and these institutions to feed the rest of the world. Right? We talked about Caribbean sugar. We said sugar was king. Right? That's the kind of thing that built the entire early, empires of Britain and Spain and Portugal and France.
Dr. Hassan, His Holiness was explaining once about how the Islamic teachings are similar to many religions, but different in the sense that if we compare it with other Abrahamic faiths, first the faith, the Jewish faith, and Moses, peace be upon him, his teachings came with a firmness to it, which was needed for the time. We believe in, for our viewers to know that Muslims believe in the prophets of all these major religions, and we hold them dear and necessary as essential part of our faith. So Moses and Jesus, peace be upon him, included. We believe that Moses came with the teachings which we know as eye for an eye. And then when Jesus, peace be upon him, came, he came with these teachings which had to bring back the balance the other way, because people had taken it too harsh at the time. After the time of any prophet, people start to move away from the original teaching. So that by the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, he had to say, if someone hits you on the right cheek, then you should present the other. And then the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, came, and he came with teachings which were for universal. He said it was for the whole world. It was the first time that a messenger came and said it was not just for a region or for a certain people, it was for everyone. And therefore he said to take the middle path, the path which was balanced in its approach. So Dr. Hassan, what lesson do you think we can take from that today? Because as I said, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. It's very difficult when you've been oppressed and oppressed and oppressed, and there doesn't seem to be any hope. It's a very difficult situation. It's easy from any standpoint just to say you should do it like this or you should do it like that. But how do you feel? You have this advantage of being from both standpoints in Africa, and now you're here, and all these Islamic teachers are taking the balanced approach. How can we take that forward?
Well, it is the magisterial teaching, isn't it? That we are being reminded that a balanced approach is the right approach. Now, if you look back and see all the steps that our predecessors have taken, some of them have yielded some results. But if they were all good, we will not be in the same situation that we are in, right? The balanced approach is the right approach. That we should demonstrate our unhappiness with the system. We should follow the law, meaning that we should not be participants of disorder. And we should use all the tools available to us to try and influence the system. So Imam Azahani's points about making sure that we take advantage of the opportunities we have in terms of going into leaders behind the scenes to try and influence them. We've talked about making sure that we vote. There has been some discussion that as citizens, we have every right to protest. But we should also be mindful that as we protest, we are not part of a group of people that are creating disorder. All of these are approaches that are balanced, well-reasoned. And personally, I don't see how we can have a long-lasting peace in any society if we don't use them. Because we know that, you use violence, and then the system itself, they just throw you in jail. If you say that you are just going to use violence, they say, well, it's against the law. They throw you in jail. Then you lose your right to vote. And we've talked about the repercussions of all of that making a living. So clearly, the teachings of Islam and what the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community has constantly reminded us of taking a balanced approach is the right one that I see would yield the outcomes that we want.
Thank you once again for joining us today. If you're not familiar with our magazine, The Review of Religions, make sure you check out our website, reviewofreligions.org, or head over to our Twitter page, Review Religions, and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel here, and also leave any comments if you want to engage in discussion on what we spoke about today. Do join us for episode 5. We have a lot more to speak about, and we're going to be going even deeper into these issues. So do join us then.